Well, a warm welcome to this Bridge India event, a very timely event, and we have an amazing panel here to discuss the Biden administration and the American-Indian relationship. Just before I start, I just wanted to highlight a few quick housekeeping points. There will be a Q&A at the end, so if you could just put your questions into the question box, and just to make sure everyone's mic is on mute. We are expecting the ambassador, I think he's running late, so I will introduce you to the panel, and we'll start when the ambassador arrives. He'll just join the conversation. So very pleased to have you all here. Thank you. I know we're all joining from different time zones right now. We have Dr. Mukesh Aghi, who is President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership. We also have Aparna Pandey, who is the Director Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute. And we also have Sarah Stewart, Executive Director, Silverado Policy Accelerator, formerly the US Office of the Trade Representative. Thank you very much for joining. And Dr. Mukesh, I wonder whether we could open with a question to yourself. And it's really to set the scene for this conversation today. Now with the world witnessing and welcoming the US back into the fold, such as NATO, the Paris Climate Agreement, do you think what do you think India really thinks about the Biden administration? As the perception has been that India and Modi were pro-Trump. I mean, who can forget Howdy Modi some time ago? So I just wanted to see what you actually thought of the Biden administration and the Indian government right now. How do you think this relationship is going to pan out?
Well, good morning and good evening to all the participants. Thank you for inviting me here. I think you have to look at the relationship between India and the US in a much larger frame. Mm-hmm. When we see the Trump administration relationship with India, especially Prime Minister Modi, it was very transactional. And it was focused more on what can President Trump get for himself. So if you look at the Howdy Modi event, was more of trying to convince the Indian Americans to vote for him. And you have to look at from perspective of Prime Minister Modi also. Any president who's there, they will make every effort to make sure the relationship stays on. Now, when you look at the Biden administration, the relationship is not going to be transactional. It will be multilateral. And when I say multilateral, it's going to focus on geopolitical aspect of the relationship, keeping in mind China. And then you look at from an economic perspective, from an environment perspective, definitely very much on the trade side. There'll be issues on H-1B visas. And then now what we're seeing is a creeping effort of partnership on vaccine diplomacy between India and the US. Because as you know, India is the largest producer of vaccines in the world. So we expect the relationship will be multilateral. It will have its challenges, especially on the issues of Kashmir, human rights. But I think bigger picture will prevail, while you'll have irritants, which I think both sides have enough maturity to manage that and take this forward.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything to that at all? Have any thoughts or comments?
Sure, if I could. I agree totally with what Dr. Aghi said, that the relationship was more transactional in the previous administration. It's going to be strategic, and it depends on three pegs that he clearly identified. There's a values-based or a people-to-people relationship, there's a defense strategic relationship, and there's an economic. The defense strategic has strengthened It's become the strongest peg in the last 2 decades, and it will remain strong as long as the US-China peer competition and peer rivalry strengthens. As long as China is a threat, the only other country with as large a population, with a military which can match, and which is a rival, and which China does consider a threat, is India. So India is going to remain important, but there will be challenges, as Dr. Agi mentioned, on the economic front. They've always been, and they will remain. On the values-based side, India has challenges within which US and a democratic administration will have questions and concerns about. Sort of the immigration issue may get slightly better, but there will be, at the end of the day, we must remember that the sort of, on the values based and on the immigration, the US will look at it from a domestic perspective, and so will India. So there will be that friction. But I do believe that at the end of the day, the US-India relationship is bigger than any administration, and it's bigger than any individual. It has grown. The last 4 American presidents have visited India, starting in 2000. One has visited twice, but each one of them has visited India. And so the India-US relationship will be strong. And let's not forget it, 2006, then Senator Biden had said that he saw the India-US relationship as one of the key or defining partnerships for the United States. And I think we will see that. Thank you.
Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I couldn't agree more with the comments that have already been said. I think if you look at the geopolitical landscape over the last decade, you see an ascendant China, and that has changed the dynamics in the region quite a bit. I think that President Biden is going to have to recalibrate how he wants to approach the US-India relationship and how he wants to deepen it. I think that there's a huge opportunity right now, both on the strategic side, but also on the economic side. And part of my comments later on trade in particular, we'll get to this, but you have 2 major trade deals in the Indo-Pacific region, and the US and India are not in either of them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is some real opportunities for the US and India to be working bilaterally on trade, which will also help with some of the strategic concerns in the region.
Thank you. Aparna, just sort of coming back to you, and you've talked about values and just kind of elaborating on maybe cultural values. The Biden administration has more Indian origin officials in senior positions, more than the Trump and the Obama administration. With this in mind, how hopeful are you that there are opportunities to create, a natural bridge between these 2 nations, and maybe there's more cultural values there?
So natural bridges have existed for decades between the 2 nations. What we are seeing today or witnessing today is actually the product of the last few decades. There are 1.4 million Indian Americans. This does not count the hundreds of thousands of Indian students and Indians who are on work visas and permanent and green card residents. And the tourists who come and people who come on short term. So there is a natural relationship. It goes back, 70, 80 or 90, almost to the early 20th century. Indian Americans are also in every sphere of American life. Just last week, the NASA Perseverance landing, Dr. Swati Mohan, somebody who is Indian descent, healthcare, academia, business, think tanks, Indian Americans are everywhere. So it's totally understandable that there would be more people of Indian origin in the Biden administration than they were in the Bush, Obama, or Trump. Indian Americans have joined politics. They've also joined the government, and so they are in every area. Further, Indian Americans tend to be more liberal and vote and support democratic administration. So they are more likely to be seen in a democratic administration than in a republic one. However, I would add a note of caution. Indian Americans, just as Indian British or Indian French, are Americans first. And there are people of Indian origin who are American citizens. So there are bridges, they are culturally Indian, but at the end of the day, their priorities and their concerns and the way they look at the relationship will be framed from the American lens. They can explain India better to their colleagues. They can understand what India does, but the priority will remain what the US would like, or what they as Americans would like the India-US relationship to be. So yes, it helps a lot. The problem, however, it also creates some challenges, right? The bigger the bigger your diaspora is, it can help you create bridges, but it will also have disagreements and differences within it. And we see that. So we see that on the issues of, India's domestic politics, Indian democracy, Kashmir, the attacks on minorities in India. We see that when it comes to economics and the economic and the trade relationship. And we'll see that when it comes to, it's not yet in the defense or the strategic arena, but I would say in all the others, especially the values-based relationship, there will be, and it's natural. So it's good that there are bridges and they will play a big role, but we must remember that at the end of the day, their perspective will be framed by their country of citizenship.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting that you've highlighted what the challenges would be, because I think we're all sort of focused on what the positives could be, but yes, there are challenges to navigate ahead. Dr. Mukesh, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think I concur with what Aparna said, but you have to understand, when you have so many leadership position which is filled by Indian American, then India also comes under the magnifying lens itself in every aspect. And while the Indian Americans can convey their feelings and opinion, they also have to maintain what I call at least minimum 1 degree of separation, so people don't see a sense of biasness coming towards in their thinking and their policy making, which is seen as favorable to India. But I think overall, you have to understand, you have a minority group which is the most affluent financially on a per capita basis, one of the most educated. They also engage most in the political campaigning environment. They are also engaged in every aspect of the corporate leadership. So I think you will see the Indian Americans, as time goes by, coming more and more under the lens. And I think their actions are seen and judged if they are being American first or Indians being first. So I think I see more opportunities between the two countries led by Indian Americans as we move forward.
Thank you. And actually quite nicely leads into your question, Doctor. And Aparna kind of touched on some of these scenarios, but in his presidential campaign, Biden criticized the Modi government, particular suppression of the Muslim majority in Jammu Kashmir. And do you think if the Biden administration were to be openly critical of such issues, it might turn the Indian public opinion against a closer relationship with Washington?
I don't think so. I think you have to understand, in democracies, when you're campaigning, you make certain statements to appease your vote banks. And at the same time, you have to understand, while the US has lost its shine of trying to give that, I call speech on human rights, while we struggle with Black Lives Matter issues in the US itself. So I think, yes, there are issues and both sides will speak. It's democracies. And by the same time, you have to understand that while India is trying to grow its economic influence in the region, yes, you have politics, you have farmers' agitation going on. It's a democracy and we can talk about that. So I don't think, to answer your question, that Biden speaking on the Kashmir Muslim rights there will have impact on the bigger picture and the relationship.
What about, do you think, I'm sort of going off kilter a little bit here, but, and it's a big subject, but I saw recently on Twitter some of the Biden administration make open comments about the Indian farmers situation right now that's going on in India. And there was a lot of backlash, or, you know, now social media is very polarized as well, but there was a lot of interaction from the Indians in India who weren't, they didn't look upon those comments very favorably, because they don't think, or they didn't think that the Americans really understood the situation. So with these kinds of things, do you think there is, I don't know, in you know, public opinion in India is, because it's so polarized, will that affect relationships?
No, it will not. You have to understand there is a communication problem with the farmers' agitation in India itself. And, you know, I will not get into details of the law which has been passed in the parliament, but you have to understand when you talk about minimum support price for the farmer, that's where the whole picture is. It is the US government which is suing in WTO India, providing minimum support price. So you have to understand that while we hear about the agitation and support, you have somebody like Rihanna tweeting on that. You know, if she wants to, she can help and change the policy with the USTR, where India supports minimum price for the farmers. So I think it's more of a communication issue. The other side you have to understand is that India does not need to have a thin skin. In a democracy, people will criticize, they will challenge you, and you have to move on. But if you react to every tweet, it just makes the problem much bigger and deeper and messier. So my recommendation is both sides communicate, but don't react to these tweets.
I just want to ask, Aparna, you're smiling there, and Sarah, you're nodding. I just want to bring you into the conversation. What do you both think? Aparna, maybe I'll start with you.
So I agree with what Dr. Agi said, you know, his second point especially, which is that if you want to be a regional power, you want to be a global or a great power, learn to develop a thick skin. The US does not react to every tweet anybody makes around the world on how the United States is, whether it's a democracy, how it's doing. Sort of being number one or wanting to be number one means developing a thick skin. And that's something which has always been a challenge with India. You know, both personally, and as a country and a civilized and a culture, we are thin-skinned. And so it's been very difficult for India to adjust to the fact that, you know, the bigger you get and the more people talk about India, which we want, the more you're bound to get some people who will criticize you on some things. And the way is to move along. Second, it is that at the end of the day, the image you have abroad is what people are going to hold you to. So if people hold the United States up to its ideals, they will also hold India up to its ideals. If you are sort of, you know, India is a democracy. It's a pluralist, open, secular society. Its constitution guarantees rights to everybody. And so they may not hold China up, even though they will criticize, but they won't hold it up to its ideals. They will hold India up. So, you know, learn to accept that just as the US is often criticized for not standing up to its ideals, you will also be criticized where you don't stand up to the ideals that your own constitution and people around the world value you for. There's an India model as a counter to a China model. People will hold you up to the India model. So those are my, you know, sort of, but I agree, at the end of the day, we have to be able to sort of, you know, take what comes. That's what democracy is. Dissent and thick skin.
So Sarah, on the topic of thick-skinned, do you have anything to add to that? Because you need a thick skin when you're negotiating trade, I guess.
I think definitely, and especially some of the issues that have come up on US-India trade. look, I mean, there's going to be criticism of any country that is trying to grow and trying to, advance and progress in a whole host of areas. And, I agree with Aparna that it is really important that criticism be taken as constructively as possible as well. There's some criticism that you can disregard, but some criticism is worth listening to. I think there is a lot of criticism that has come out against the US in the last, let's say even decade, and towards India, and both countries have to internalize that and think, where is this criticism coming from? Is there any truth to this? Can we grow from this? Because if there is a constituency of people that are criticizing us for certain things that we're doing, maybe those are data points that we need to take back and reflect upon. And I think that that's very important. In my own experience, I think the US, for example, was criticized, across the board by many countries, including its allies, for its policy on China tariffs. On the other hand, India has been criticized for some moves that has taken on things like digital services taxes. Now, whether those policies are right or wrong, listening to the full range of stakeholders and what they have to say and how this is impacting them, I think is extremely important. And you can't have a thin skin to do it. You have to say, let me take the best of this, internalize it. Maybe I don't act on it. Maybe this isn't, the path forward, but I have to think through, and getting that type of criticism is absolutely essential to working through in a democratic society. I could not agree more on that.
I think we're all with you there. I mean, and just sort of staying with you, Sarah, on trade. And again, it's kind of dipping into your question here is, how different do you think trade negotiations with the Biden administration will be for India compared to the Trump administration? Because after all, Trump was a businessman and not a politician.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a great question. I think time will tell. What I can offer is maybe some context as to how I saw the negotiations with US and India under the Trump administration, and what I think we might be able to expect out of the Biden administration. For those of us who were following the last few years of US-India negotiations, there was a lot of back and forth with, I think, some good progress at moments in certain areas towards a mini deal of sorts. Ultimately, as everybody knows, that deal never concluded. I think it did provide both sides the opportunity to have better understanding of what they were looking for and where there was going to be political challenges to agreement. I think that with the Trump administration having left and a new Biden administration in place, you can already see India positioning to figure out, what is this new administration looking for? Minister Goyal came out just last week, I believe, with some statements about, okay, so where do we go from here? I'm guessing that this old deal is off the table. What does a new deal look like? I think it's absolutely right for him to be thinking that way. A new administration has to really spend some time thinking through what the trade policy is going to be. What are the priorities? What are the priority countries? Will it be focused on enforcement? Will it be focused on negotiations? Everything that we've heard so far is that the next USTR will likely focus in large part on enforcement, and negotiations may be prioritized for those countries like the UK, where discussions have already been underway. I think that for India, as I mentioned earlier, there is a real opportunity here to deepen US-India relations and it will not be without its challenges. There's still a number of issues that the two countries need to work through, particularly in the digital trade space and the tariff space. I think that it's possible for them to overcome that. And I think that there are some new areas of opportunity, such as climate change and other environmental progress that can be made in renewable energy and other things that are going to be really big priorities for the Biden administration. I think that, focusing on trying to get rid of some of the trade irritants that are there, focusing on new areas such as climate change, that will help to set a table for negotiations with the Biden administration. Whether they want to continue on the Trump path of a mini deal in exchange for possible GSP if that program is renewed, or look at something, more comprehensive, I think time will tell. But in my experience, it's never too early for the two sides to really start talking and to get to know one another and to start to develop those relationships with an eye towards the future.
Thank you. That's a very detailed response, and really interesting when you talk about enforcement, because that wasn't one thing I was thinking. I was thinking more of the climate change side of things, but that's really key. Dr. Agi and Aparna, would you like to add anything to what Sarah said, or some of your thoughts around that? Doctor, would you like to go first, and then I'll bring in Aparna?
Yeah, I think the philosophy in trade discussion will shift. When we look at Trump administration was more focused on market access. And whereas when we look at the current leadership coming in, especially Catherine Tai, who is more of a labor rights expert also beside being a trade expert, you will see philosophy shifting. And what I see is they will bring in the trade discussion beside market access and, human rights and labor rights. So I see some sense of friction coming in. And I see also from India's side, I think the whole attraction of GSP is no longer there. When you look at India's export to the US, which are in the GSP category, they've grown much faster than the normal exports from India to the US. So I think GSP is no longer a benefit to India. Yes, if it comes in, it does help small exporters, but it is no longer I call it a trade negotiating point itself. So I think, and the way I see it is the priority is not going to be India. I think they need to focus initially China, because that's where the trade gap is. And once you start building a framework in that direction, then they'll start moving towards India.
But you're actually predicting a friction.
I'm not saying there's a friction. I think there will be more points of disagreement and negotiation coming in. The trade aspect of India-US is very important. We are seeing more and more of US R&D moving to India. What we also see is in the trade side, India will also bring in H-1B visa issues, because that's one of the biggest export India has, services to the US. So I think it will get broader, complex, and it will take some time.
Thank you. Aparna, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of take it up maybe 40,000 feet because, Sarah and Dr. Agi know the details better than I do. But Hudson just brought out a report on sort of, or a policy on what the Biden administration should do for India-US trade and economic ties. And our basic argument is that, it needs to be a strategic perspective. And Delhi has traditionally not viewed the economic or the trade relationship with the United States as strategically as it has viewed the defense military side of the relationship. The economic tensions which are there today are not new. They have been there for 2 decades or more. whether it's market access, whether it's tariffs, whether it's, agriculture, whether it's WTO. Yes, the digital, privacy rules are newer because, technology is updating and changing. But many of the underlying concerns remain. On the Indian side, there's a tendency towards protectionism. On the Indian side, there's a tendency towards self-sufficiency. There's a desire that everything is made in India. So during the Trump administration, the tension was stronger because there was an America first versus a make in India. That America sort of build back better is different from America first, but the focus is still on building the US economy and becoming competitive. If India wants to sort of become part of the global supply chains, if India wants to be part of the global economy and the global trade, it needs to play a bigger role in the global trade rather than staying out of it. And unfortunately, what has happened in the last few years is that, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, India is not part of, yes, there are strategic reasons India isn't part of RCEP. And, TPP India doesn't even make the cut. But there are reasons why India there are reasons for India to play a bigger role on the global trade arena. There are reasons for India to open up its economy. There are benefits India will get. But at the end of the day, that is something which Indian politicians and leaders will need to decide, that is the economic trade part of the relationship as strategically important to India's rise as the defense part. And I'm still not sure that they understand that without economics, you cannot be a great power. Thank you.
Fascinating. Everyone's points were really interesting. I mean, we have quite a few questions, but just before we go into the questions, does anyone want to sort of add anything to the whole discussion that we've had in the first half hour? Any points that we think haven't come across?
Let me add to Aparna's point. I think India has to start thinking of integrating itself in the global supply chain. We have an opportunity where US companies are looking at China plus one strategy. And they will not have all of their manufacturing in China and then export to the rest of the world. They will have their manufacturing in China for the Chinese market, and they're looking for alternative. And India has an opportunity to attract that. And if you start having closed borders for these companies to come in or import components, then you can't be part of the global supply chain. And one of the areas which I like to propose is, while India is very much aligned geopolitically from a defense perspective on a quad relationship between Australia, Japan, India, and the US, why can't we also start thinking of having an economic quad among the four economies? Because the four economies make almost $33 trillion worth of GDP. And it'll be easy transition for India to start looking at US as an economic quad, looking at Japan as an economic quad, looking at Australia. And I think that's an easy transition than going to RCEP or into TPP. So I think that's one area we need to explore further to see how India integrates itself in an economic quad, which is at the moment a military quad.
Aparna, would you like to respond to that?
I agree with what Dr. Agi is saying. I mean, I think economic quad is an option. So is, I believe there's going to be a forum or meeting of the democracies, whether it is G7 or D10 or D11. That would also be a big market because that would include UK, many countries in Europe, again, countries with whom India is aligned on the defense strategic realm and therefore the economic realm. But I agree, I mean, economic quad may be easier for India to transition because I think, as we all know, India prefers smaller groups rather than very big groups immediately. So maybe, a 4-member group and then, a 10 or 11-member group may be easier. And all three countries, US, Japan, and Australia, support India's rise. And understand India's concerns on the strategic fronts. And I'm sure they also do on the economic front. So that would be a great way for India to go.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
I don't know that there's much to add other than to say that, I concur. When we first started this discussion earlier, I said that, I think the dynamics have changed. And I think that what once drove trade policy or other economic policy in previous years, that's not the same anymore. There is a change. And I think that there is definitely a bigger connection than ever before between the strategic and the economic. And that has to be recognized. And hopefully that will also be a way forward for the US and India to work through some of the irritants that have, troubled the bilateral relationship, is to say, okay, well, on the one hand, we have these irritants that we need to deal with. On the other, we have a long-term future opportunity here that could potentially mean the great progress, economic growth, and strategic alliances of this century. So I think we've really got to have the countries, and including with the allies, maybe it's through the Quad, to get rid of some of these, lingering issues, find a path forward there, and then start to address some of these bigger, longer term issues.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so we're going to go straight into the questions. We've got quite a few questions that have come in. So I think, Sarah, probably, because I think you mentioned transactional, and just sort of staying with you for a moment. This is a question from Dida Singh from Delhi, who's asked, why do we think the Trump relationship was transactional with Biden? And with Biden, it may not be.
I think that there were lots of policy considerations that went into the trade and broader policy of the Trump administration. But I do think that one big consideration was, can we get a deal done? I was one of the negotiators on the USMCA. I think it was an incredible feat that we were able to negotiate that agreement in as fast of a time as we did and conclude it. I think that there was a transactional aspect to it, but also, it was also very substantive. With India, I think that there was these lingering issues I have been talking about, whether it's tariffs or digital trade or others, medical devices, that have been out there for a while. The idea was to try and get a deal done. You can call that transactional. He was a businessman. President Trump did want to be able to say, I got the deal. I think with Biden, it will be different in the sense that any new administration coming in has to be very deliberate and strategic about the policies that they're setting in motion. This administration in particular has prided itself on wanting to be extremely transparent and go through the right interagency processes that take some time, but that ultimately come out with policies that are, intended to be, very well thought out and interconnected. And so I think, as Dr. Mukesh pointed out, this administration's focus on worker rights, on environment, on other things, they need to build that in to how they're going to be looking at the relationships with other countries. And I think that in and of itself will make it less transactional. And I don't want to say values driven, but to some extent, it'll be principle driven or values driven. It's got to be driven by, what the new administration lays down as far as, here's our orientation on where we're going with trade policy and broader foreign policy towards these countries. And we're going to use that as our North Star.
Dr. Mukesh, do you have anything to add to Sarah's?
Well, yes, what Sarah says is right. I just want to point out, when GSP was withdrawn, it was month of May, and Modi was at the height of his re-election campaign. And to withdraw that GSP at that time gave a lot of ammunition to the opposition, saying, you've gone out of your way to support President Trump. And what he gave you was, he took away one of the benefits India has in trade with the US. When you look at Trump going to Houston, basically the whole objective was to woo the Indian American vote. Trump coming into India for 36 hours, where Modi put the red carpet, was just to send a message to people, voter banks in the US itself. So I see the relationship was very, very transactional. And if you look at what did Modi get in return, almost nothing. And whereas when I look at the Biden administration, they are going through a normal process, interagency process, as Sarah mentioned. I think they will look at a bigger picture. They will look at every aspect of the relationship, from geopolitics to H-1B. So we see approach from Biden administration to be more multilateral than transactional. And I'm very optimistic about that, because you have leadership which has a lot of experience, and they value India. They value India's relationship on a broader scale. So I think you will see the relationship moving forward, either be on the trade side, defense side, in a positive fashion.
Thank you. Aparna?
Just one quick response to the question, which is that, at the end of the day, the difference between the transactional and strategic is that the US has believed for the last 15 to 20 years plus that the rise of India economically, militarily, and as a democracy is good and is important for US strategic interests. And therefore, giving India, helping India rise is important. The transactional relationship would be one which says, if you give me this, I am going to give you this. If you don't give me this, I will not do this for you. And so traditionally speaking, the US relationship towards India has been strategic, and it has not been transactional. I echo Sarah, I echo Dr. Aghi, that the Biden administration will go back to viewing India as a strategic partner and a country whose rise is important for US and US national security interests as well.
Thank you. Actually, Aparna, we have a question for you from Nilesh Solanki from here in the UK, from Newcastle. And it's following on from your point. And they say, just because Indian Americans are in government, it's not just a slam dunk for India because they are American first, then Indian. So maybe the number of Indian origin people in government only helps with optics, not with actual policies. Do you have a point to that?
Yeah, so I know I said the first part of what he just said, but I would disagree with the second half of what he said. Yes, at the end of the day, they will look at the relationship as an American citizen. But I do believe there are three advantages of having more people of Indian origin within the administration, within academia, in the corporate sector. One, you have somebody who understands the country, explain it to you. Very often, India's policies are opaque. And unless you actually understand how the government functions, what the context is, you don't understand why India is doing what it does. Second, US policy is made by those in a 2-year or a 4-year cycle. So if you have people who understand the country in the administration on the Hill, then it's more likely that policies even the long-term strategic policies, there's somebody who's explaining why it is important to keep up the relationship with India, why it is important to not react to this something which Delhi has done, or to react and to help India when it is adopting a certain policy. And third, we should never forget the importance of symbols and optics. sort of, this is the first time that the US has sort of, a female as on the vice president, on the vice presidential, office. And second, somebody whose parents were immigrants to this country. And she is Indian American. So it matters. Optics matter. At the end of the day, what we look for is that people should look at the relationship, should understand the value. And while content matters, never underestimate the importance of optics and symbols.
I'm with you there. I agree. Dr. Mukesh, I saw you nodding. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. To bucket all Indian American into one group is not the right way to have that discussion, because you have first generation immigrants and you have second generation. The first generation immigrants tend to have more emotional attachment back to India, whereas the second generation Indian Americans are just like any other American who do not have that emotional attachment back to India. And the other factor you have to understand is that when you're driving policy and you have basically under the scanner by the Congress, by the opposition, you'll be much more cautious driving a policy which shows from the optic perspective it favors India. So I think you'll see the Indian American policymakers be much more stringent towards India in that aspect to manage the optics also.
Thank you. This is actually a trade question, and it's from the UK. So I'll direct that to you, Sarah, to start with. Has coronavirus meant that the US administration is distracted away from big strides forward with trade and economic relations with India? So has the coronavirus distracted government?
I think that the coronavirus, especially in the early days, did definitely divert some attention away from, not just US, India, but, lots of different things that were happening. I don't think that that's necessarily the case anymore. I think that there are definitely issues that it has raised on supply chain that is worth the US and India continuing to discuss. But I would not see that as the reason why US-India discussions may or may not proceed under the new administration. I see that as a bigger issue that has to do with the administration coming in and deciding what its priorities are going to be and what that agenda is going to be, and when, it's going to start having discussions with India or other trading partners for that matter. So I don't think that that will be the driver of things to come in the next, even 6 to 12 months or even longer than that.
Does anyone have anything to add? Doctor, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the interests of companies and keep it away from the policy side. The US FDI investment in India on a year-to-year basis is up a double digit. That's one aspect. The other is when you look at India and China, a lot of US companies are seriously looking at India as a second manufacturing hub. And I will give you an example of Apple. Almost a year, or I'm gonna say almost 18 months ago, Apple was exporting very minimal smartphones, which are being assembled in India. Today, they are exporting almost over 400,000 smartphones on a monthly basis out of India to the rest of the world. And now they're talking about manufacturing iPads in India. Now, that's not because of US policy. This is more of an India's policy. They came with a PLI scheme where the manufacturing companies were tied to what you call production-linked incentives. And there were billions of dollars of incentive for these companies to move their manufacturing, create an ecosystem so you can export. So while US is still going through a transition with Biden administration, they're still working on trying to define what policies they're going to have in India. Companies are not going to wait. They see India as an opportunity, regardless of what the challenges are, and keep on trying to get the market share there.
Thank you. We have two more questions. So this question, I think, Sarah, because I think you talked about warfare and defense. So this is a question from Ganga Devi in India. By the end of 2021, Russia will begin delivering S-400 surface-to-air missile systems to India, which will raise the issue of whether or not the White House should grant a related sanctions waiver. How would that affect the India-US relationship? Big question there.
I'm not sure I'm the person to answer this. This is not, this area is not really my wheelhouse. So maybe I'm going to push this one over, over to Aparna.
Aparna.
No, thanks. So this is the CATSA sanction, and this is the CATSA waiver people are talking about. So India purchased the S-400, supposed to be delivered, and the US Congress had passed a bill which basically said that, you know, any country which purchases these large items from Russia would be sanctioned. Turkey has gone through this process. Turkey purchased the S-400. Turkey also wanted F-35s from the US, and it was not granted because the sanction came on Turkey. But I mean, there are three things to keep in mind here, I'd say. One, there's a sort of the India-US relationship is strong enough, I believe, that both sides have long had discussions on what India purchases from Russia. India has purchased, so sort of India has a long defense relationship with Russia, mainly the Soviet Union, because India used to purchase a lot of items. Most of the Indian military equipment is still vintage Soviet equipment, whether it's in the Air Force or the Navy and so there are a lot of items India purchases which are supply parts. S-400 is big, but India has strategic reasons why India purchased it. Second, the US, the sort of India's purchase or actual acceptance of the S-400 may trigger the CATSA sanctions. I'm one of those who hopes they won't happen, because at the end of the day, India is a strategic partner. India is at the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. India is the key country you need when you are in a peer competition or rivalry with China. So I do believe that both the Congress and the executive at the White House will sort of ensure that these sanctions are not imposed or a waiver is given to India. But third, I would sort of, saying this, and I would still sort of put a note of caution that India should not, Delhi should not believe that it is a slam dunk and that the waiver will be given automatically. The waiver is something which is the privilege of the White House and the president to do. I do believe the Biden administration will give a waiver, but I also believe that Delhi should make sure that the communication continues at all levels, and sort of we don't presume that it will happen and then we are shocked with the fact that it happens. And why do I think that sanctions won't? Because the India-US relationship has gone through periods when Indians, especially of a certain generation, do remember what happened when in 1974, the US government, then President Carter, actually stopped supply of nuclear fuel to the Tarapur nuclear reactor. India has gone through sanctions which were imposed when India had the nuclear tests. So there's a history of India experiencing the adverse impact of US sanctions, and I don't think any US administration would want that to happen. But we should be alert, and we shouldn't expect it to come just naturally either.
Thank you. I like the way you describe the Russian old missiles or planes as vintage. I thought that was very diplomatic. Dr. Mukesh, would you have anything to add to that at all? Or
yeah, I'll give a different perspective, and that is India is a sovereign nation. It has a right to decide what it buys from whom it buys. Yes, today 52% of its platform is Soviet, Russian based. And if you look at the last 20 years, it's transitioning slowly into more of European and US-based defense equipment. And CATSI is more of a US legislative move. And I think to impose that will have an impact on the US-India relationship. So as India rises, it needs to have its own sovereign rights to take that decision if it buys Soviet, Russian, and European. And to impose a US law will send a wrong message.
Thank you. We have one last question, and I'll leave it open to whoever on the panel would like to answer first. And it's a question from the UK. It's actually a panel question. How does the panel view any enhanced cooperation on the attainment of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, the most pressing agenda of our times? It's much more than just climate change. So who would like to answer first? Sarah.
Start with an environmental background. I think it's more pressing than ever. The US and India are among the top 10 global emitters. They have got to work together. I think multilaterally, towards good outcomes within the Sustainable Development Goals, but also within the Paris Agreement. And I think that they need to be working bilaterally and on a regional basis across the board on reducing emissions, on promoting renewable and clean energy, on embracing environmental technologies and making them, more accessible to more people. I think it is absolutely critical and a defining issue of our time.
Thank you. Aparna? Or no? Doctor, would you like to add anything to the last question?
Yes, I think from an India perspective, I would say that environment is a big issue. It is having an impact on the health side, on the economic side, and I think a close partnership. And I think India's taken the lead. If you look at from a solar energy perspective, there is a potential to work together between Modi government and Biden administration, especially on air quality, on water, on if you look at the agitation of farmers, is tied to a lot to water itself. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity between two countries to cooperate and collaborate on the environment issues.
Thank you. Well, that's our last question, and it's actually just taken us just to the hour. I have certainly learned a lot in this last hour, particularly about India and America and how the future might unfold. It's left me with optimism. I do hope we start doing more on climate change. I think the world needs it. We're ready right now for it. There are interesting times ahead for all of us. And I think now the world has hope. And that's what you've left us with today, is that there is certainly hope on the table. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's joined from around the world for your questions and for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You.
Pleasure.